All right, we will go ahead and get started. So welcome, and thank you everyone for registering. We are recording this presentation. There's a number of people that had registered and were hoping to make it, but then said that something came up and they weren't able to. So what we'll do is we'll record this, we'll put it on our YouTube channel, and we'll keep it up for a short amount of time, and then we'll go ahead and take that down after about a month or so, but we'll give everyone a chance to rewatch it and pick up on some of those things that you may have missed, or those that didn't actually make it to the event, we'll give them a chance to read through it or watch it as well. So again, thank you. And I'm Matt Carter. I'm Executive Director for the Dakota County Historical Society, and we are joined today by Dr. Jeremy Nino with Nienow Cultural Consultants. And I won't go into too much overview of the project and everything and why we're here, because a lot of that will be covered in the video. But I do want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society. This presentation is being sponsored through a grant, legacy grant. We had a Heritage Partnership grant for the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. That is a joint effort between the Dakota County Historical Society, the Scott County Historical Society, and the Ramsey County Historical Society. Through that, we were able to hire Jeremy as a contract archaeologist for our project, and he really led the way throughout this entire thing. And we're nearing the end of it now. COVID played a big role in why we're doing this virtually and not in person. But I think one of the great things about doing these virtual is right now we had about 50 people registered, which is great. They're all across the state of Minnesota. So, well, maybe not surprisingly, I don't know, but less than a quarter of the registrants were actually from Dakota County itself. So that's interesting to see on a presentation on recent archaeology in Dakota County. But I think that it just shows that there is interest by the general public in archaeology in general. So we had a great time with this grant project that we've been working on. As we go forward with this presentation, some of you have already pointed out or noticed, we are asking everyone to keep your microphones muted. That way, throughout the event, as we watch the video and as we do our question and answer, that there's no feedback or outside noise that would interrupt that for the other viewers. There is, if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you put your mouse and kind of circle around inside that Zoom chat box or the box in general, at the very bottom when it pops up, there is a chat box, a chat function. We will go ahead and be using that as our question and answer. So if you have a question throughout the video, feel free to throw that in there. And at the end of the event, we will go ahead and address as many of those as we can. If you want, you are welcome to have your camera on. There is a chance it would be recorded, so just keep that in mind if you don't want to be on that recorded version. So with that, I will introduce Dr. Jeremy Nino. He, as I mentioned, is with Nienow Cultural Consultants. He is a passionate cultural resource preservation consultant and educator. He is registered professional archaeologist with more than 25 years experience throughout the Midwest, and he has met the Secretary of Interior standards for both prehistoric and historic archaeology, which is great for us because that was one of the main focuses of this grant project. He's well known throughout the historical society and archaeological communities. He served on boards, conducted field work, and done numerous public speaking events, some with us and just general on his own, as well as his own scholarly publications. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy if you want to do any quick introduction, and then we will go ahead and start that video right away.
Great. All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeremy, and it's the important things to sort of format as we go here. We're going to be watching a video that I recorded with an individual by the name of Barry Madore of Fire on the Bluff Productions. We needed to do that because of COVID, and when we were getting ready to the point we're doing some presentations and whatnot, it turns out we couldn't do those in face-to-face anymore, and just because of the CDC guidelines, it wasn't very tenable. So we started producing this series of presentations, and they were really quite successful. And because I can polish them, there's lots of imagery that goes into them. If you want to view any of those, you just go over to YouTube, you search for Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. Don't put that in, but put in MAHSC. they'll immediately pop up at the very top. There's one other organization in the entire world that has MAHSC as its abbreviations. So we have a channel. You can subscribe to that channel, and we can continue to post videos and things there. Not only is there an overview video for what the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative has been all about for the last several years, but then specific ones on the Scott County, the Dakota County, and the Ramsey County investigations that we did this time around. It was a very successful project. We learned an awful lot about archaeology in each of these counties, and it's a continuation of work that was begun several years ago, and really since the 1960s, when people have been recording archaeological sites in their own backyards. At the conclusion of the video, we will have time for a question and answer period. You'll be typing in using that chat function your questions, and then I'll be answering those. You can ask them about things from the video, but you can ask them generally about archaeology in Minnesota. That's my preference. Or you can ask them about archaeology, any topic within archaeology. Just realize that although I do have 25 years experience in the field and have worked in the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia area, as well as the Midwest, I'm not a font of all archaeological knowledge. And people tend to ask me a lot of questions too about fossils. I don't know anything about fossils at all. My dad said, my daughter says I am a fossil now, since I'm in my mid 40s, so it shows what she knows. Without further ado, so this is the second of the videos for Dakota County Historical Society. Go back and watch that first one that talks about the overall program at your leisure. So I'm going to turn off my camera and also my microphone, and then I'm going to start the video. Matt will jump in if anything goes awry and he cannot see it. So here we go.
Welcome to this installment in our series of 4 conversations with archaeologist Jeremy Nino. This series is sponsored by the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative and focuses on archaeological work undertaken in 3 of the collaborative's Minnesota counties, Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott. This work was conducted by Principal Investigator Nino along with his firm, Nino Cultural Consultants. My name is Barry Madore. I had the honor of hosting these conversations with Jeremy. Our first conversation was an overview of the project as a whole. The other 3 focus on the work accomplished in each specific county. Our conversations were held virtually with only our voices being recorded. So what you'll be watching is not so much a video of us talking, but more of a presentation. While we talk, you'll see photos, maps, and documents highlighting both the archaeological work itself and the historical research Nino completed during the project, which began in 2019 and wrapped up in the spring of 2020. Before we begin, you should know that this project was funded in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with a Heritage Partnership Program grant administered by the Minnesota Historical Society and awarded to the Dakota County Historical Society in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. Enjoy the presentation. I'm here with Dr. Jeremy Nino, PhD RPA of Nino Cultural Consultants. And today we're going to be talking about the collaborative project's work in Dakota County. If you haven't seen it already, you should check out the overview conversation I had with Jeremy that talks about the beginning of the collaborative and the overall scope of the project that we're having through these discussions. That will give you a good introduction to each of the counties and the work that was done in them. Today we're going to talk about Dakota County. So take it away, Jeremy. What can you tell us about the overview of what you did in Dakota County and the different sites and what was happening?
Well, thank you very much for having me here today and for continuing to do these conversations for the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. The work that we conducted in Dakota County was really the ideal setting for this Alpha Sites project or previously known Sites project. In each of the other counties, we had particular challenges that we encountered or specific sites that we were trying to identify. But for Dakota County, we didn't come into it with any presumption about where we were going to go or what we were going to look at. All we knew when we started the project is we wanted to look at least one historic site and one prehistoric site. So prehistoric sites are archaeological sites that are from Native Americans or from 1500 and earlier, and historic sites are 1500 and forward, or in the case here in Minnesota, usually after French Euro-American contact with Native peoples. Any archaeological sites during that time frame are considered to be, whether they're from the fur trade or something like that, are considered to be historic sites. So we wanted to look at an informed upon, or alpha site, if you will, that was from the prehistoric time period and from the historic time period. And we actually ended up looking at two historic and two prehistoric for each of those different types when we got into Dakota County. We started this process by first looking at what had been done in previous rounds of grant funding. There was a second round that specifically pulled together all of the alpha site information for Dakota County. The archaeologist that was involved with that was Stephen Blondo from Blondo Consulting, and he and his team pulled together a resource, a volume of information about these previously known but never recorded with the state archaeological sites, and then gave some recommendations on the ones that could be the best fit for doing additional survey. They attempted to go out and do a little bit of work during their own time frame, but because of weather and other issues, they were not able to do really much of any archaeological work, so that became the next focus in this next grant round, which luckily I was able to do. So in Dakota County, what we did is we set up a parameter around a series of protocols for what would be good sites to actually go out and look for. So for prehistoric sites, we wanted to look for archaeological sites that were already recorded as alpha sites, so that something was known about them, somebody had done some kind of work in the past, or for historic sites, there had already been something on a map or a plat or something that had shown there to be something of interest. So we had that base amount of information, and then we wanted to have, in the case of prehistoric sites, we want to have a large agricultural field or something that had been plowed, that had good visibility, that was nearby water, that was in a prime location for finding an archaeological site. Archaeologists know quite a bit about where people like to live in the past, and the answer to that is that people in the past like to live exactly where we like to live nowadays, which is near bodies of water and near access to resources and good visibility on the landscape. So we wanted to find some farms where one landowner had a large several acre land on an alpha site, and we could get permission from them. We tried to focus on sites that didn't have multiple landowners that owned them, because that tends to get complicated and messy. You have to ask a lot of people for permission. So we categorized all of these. We came up with a series of them. We recommended to Dakota County and the executive director over there, Matthew Carter, which ones would make the most sense. Then he, from that list, chose a short list of two sites for us to look at. The first of them was called the Dutch Creek Mound site, and the other one was called the No Name Mound site. So two prehistoric sites that both had mound groups associated with them, at least in the past, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. For the historic properties, the first was the Hampton Mill, located in the tiny city of Hampton, and the other one was the B.H. Pettingill House, which is located just immediately south of the oil refinery, or the City of Lights, as my daughter likes to call it when we drive past it. It's a bright, smelly place. So that's where it's at. So these were the two sites that we ended up focusing on. While we were doing our research, we did, and looking at all the different alpha sites, and we did this for all of the counties too when we were doing the work, we went back and we took Blondo's information, and we did our own set of literature reviews, and then we started actually compiling all that information together and deciding, do we really think that that site is still there anymore? And we had some really interesting sites that were in the city of Hastings, and I've done some archaeological work in the city of Hastings, specifically at the Leduc Mansion, and it's near and dear to my heart, the work that's been done out there by me and several other archaeologists in the past. So there were some interesting archaeological sites in Hastings that ultimately we found out, well, they were mismarked on the map, or we know that mill has been moved, or we know that mound group is now underneath the parking lot. So some of those we sort of crossed off our short list right away. We wanted to focus on archaeological sites where we had a good probability of actually finding something. That was the goal throughout each of these three different counties. In Dakota County, this is the best example of it. Of all three of the counties, we found and documented two prehistoric sites we want to look at and two historic sites we want to look at.
Let's start off with the prehistoric sites. You said there were two sites that both had mounds located on them. Were you looking at those mounds or trying to find where those mounds had been located? located?
Right. So the two sites, which again are the Dutch Creek Mounds, and that's 21 DK AD. So archaeological sites that are alpha sites get lettered instead of numbered. So if these were recorded archaeological sites that have been documented previously by an archaeologist, it would be 21, which is the Minnesota's trinomial system, and then DK would be Dakota County, and then it would have been number 1 through however many archaeological sites are in the county. These actually have letters. So 21 DK AD says that it's an alpha site, and it's the 24th plus a few more numbers. So there's multiple alpha sites that are there. Both of these mound groups were actually initially discussed by a man named Winchell, who was a geologist here in Minnesota and was also heavily interested in archaeology, and he was very involved with the Minnesota Historical Society. Winchell's most famous for his publication of the Geology of Minnesota, a several-volume set in the late 1800s. And in it, he documents, because he's interested in geology, but he's also interested in previous peoples that were living here at the time. And geology and ancient history were sort of combined together as one topic of interest. So Native Americans were thought of oftentimes in a natural setting, which is why things like the Natural History Museum might have, interesting megafauna that used to live in the past in an area, and it might also have archaeological sites of people who also lived here in the past. As an anthropologist, I separate the natural and cultural worlds, obviously, but we didn't always do that. And so Geology of Minnesota not only includes fascinating information about the geology of various different counties, but it also had information about early archaeological sites. So he notes both of these mound groups as being related in Dakota County that consist of several mounds at each location. He gives a township section range information for them and talks about them on the landscape and the fact that they're being farmed around and things like that. What's interesting is that he actually tasks avocational archaeologists, a couple of guys, one's a surveyor and one was a newspaper editor, who become the earliest archaeologists doing work here in the state of Minnesota. He wants these two individuals to actually go out and document as many mound groups as they can in Minnesota. So this work, this volume of work that they begin in the late 1800s, ultimately culminates in the publication of Aborigines of Minnesota, which is published by Winchell in 1911. And it's a beautiful volume with drawings of all the different tens of thousands of mapped mounds. They do amazing, impeccable work with little narrative and write-ups about all these different types of mounds, whether they're conical, small circular mounds, or linear mounds, or effigy mounds that are actually shaped into the forms of different animals, birds and bears and things like that. But in Aborigines of Minnesota, he doesn't talk about these two archaeological sites, the Dutch Creek Mounds and the Nienow Mounds. He doesn't include them in that group. And I think that's the first clue that you have as an archaeologist that, all right, well, he initially thinks there's these mound groups in the landscape. Somebody goes back and does additional work, and he doesn't include these as mound groups in his next body of work. So just in 20 years, people said, I have a second thoughts about this site. What he did, though, is he encouraged, after 1911, he encouraged local avocational archaeologists to go out and identify these mounds and actually take a look at them. And there was a whole series of people operating throughout Minnesota that were interested in the past and that were investigating things scientifically. Unfortunately, one of the ways that they did that is they dug into burial mounds. We haven't dug into burial mounds since the 1970s here in Minnesota officially. Archaeologists have stopped doing that a long time ago. We recognized almost 50 plus years ago now that digging into cemeteries is not the way to go about getting information about the past. And that was actually codified into several Minnesota laws, the Cemetery Act, later on a national law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that said that not only do we not dig into burial mounds, but if you have dug into burial mounds in the past, whoever you are, if you have cultural remains from burials, whether they're actually skeletal materials or artifacts from those items of cultural patrimony, headdresses, drums, things like that, that those need to be given back to living Native American groups, and then they will decide what to do with them. And universally, those materials have been reburied after the repatriation process. So Winchell had several individuals that were operating in the early 1900s out in this part of Dakota County. One of them, E.W. Schmidt, he and several of his contemporaries went and did some limited excavations into the mounds, and they didn't find any materials in the mounds. Furthermore, they noted in their work that the mounds appeared to have some similarities across them. One, that the soil appeared to be homogeneous, or it seemed to be the same throughout the mound. The layers that have soil in it were the normal layers that you would see as you start at the ground surface with dark, loamy soil, and as you dig deeper into the ground, the soil gets lighter and lighter as the fewer organic materials in it, until ultimately you have gravels or sands that are left over from when the glaciers came through. So it was a very normal soil profile. So Schmidt notices this, and not only do they not find cultural materials, but the mounds themselves appear to be homogeneous, and that this indicates that they in fact are not cultural mounds.
Naturally occurring?
Naturally occurring mounds. So we call these Mema Mounds. That's our abbreviation for these naturally occurring mound groups. And essentially, our geologic landscape of glaciers coming through, piling up moraine materials all over the landscape, and then erosional events happening after that, we have lots and lots of weird-shaped hills everywhere in Minnesota. And people in the past thought that these could be burial mounds. So later on, an archaeologist in 2012 also went out and looked at these and also thought that they potentially would not be mounds. So even by a few years ago, people were like, okay, I'm really not very certain about these. So we thought, what better two examples? Let's go and walk in the fields, because people have been hyper-focused on the mounds. They haven't been looking at the fields around them.
Right.
Let's go and look and see if we can actually find archaeological materials in the fields that surround these two different mound groups. So that's what we did.
How would you determine now if the mounds are presumed or assumed?
Oh, I know where you're going with this question.
Are you able to make a current assessment about the nature of those, whether they're naturally occurring or not? And if
this is a sticky question.
If you're able to even get access to the mounds themselves, how would you go about this?
Right. So what we would expect to see in a mound, if it was cultural or human-made, is we know that in the past, because we have narratives of individuals that actually came into contact with Native peoples who were doing this kind of building, is they would actually load things by large baskets that they had woven. So they would basically pile the soil into the basket, dump it out where they want to make the mound. They don't have the same shovel system that we were using. They actually made hoes and things out of animal bone. But they would basket load these mounds. And so when you cut them in profile, and I've seen examples of these from previous archaeological excavations, none that I have done because I don't dig into mound groups. When you look in the profile, you see these individual basket loads in that profile. So that's what you would expect to see. And so Schmidt is exactly right. If the soil looks all uniform and the same and looks like it's been layered down by natural processes, it's probably not cultural. We have a group of archaeologists that work closely with Native American tribal entities, specifically the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, or MIAC. They work with one archaeological group that's based out of Hamline University to actually investigate mound groups. Archaeologists can certainly be involved, even myself as an archaeologist can be involved in construction projects where we know there could be a mound group nearby, and so we're monitoring that construction work. We're trained to know what human remains look like. At that point, if you did find human remains, you would call the sheriff, stop the construction project, call the state archaeologist, and then my work would essentially be done at that point. I would not be the archaeologist involved with any recovery efforts or anything like that. Those people are specifically trained and specifically licensed to do that work with the state archaeologist's office and with Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. So what we would recommend is two processes. We do some non-invasive work with ground-penetrating radar to essentially radar the landscape and look and see what's beneath the earth. And we have several different individuals that do that kind of work here in Minnesota today. Another thing that you can do is a individual that's selected by one of these groups could go out with a soil probe, and they could probe across the top of that soil and see if the soil horizons, even in that small core, do they mimic natural soils or do they mimic cultural soils? And that's the way that I would go about doing that work. I would do a literature review first. I would look and see if you have any historic documentation of these mounds. I would look at aerial photography of them. I would then look at something called LiDAR, which essentially is information that comes from lasers, and it can go through foliage and record the topography of a landscape very minutely. And you can look at shadings of that surface without vegetation on it to see, does this look more like a mound group
or does this look more natural? So archaeologists have a lot of different tools at our fingertips to use besides digging a hole with a shovel. And that's one of the things people always think about archaeologists. Well, we have
pith helmet.
I dig holes. And I do. I dig a lot of holes. Right. I don't own a pith helmet. I don't have a whip. I don't have a pistol, but I have laser technology. I've got 3D imaging cameras. I've got, ground penetrating radar, metal detectors, all kinds of other things that we can look at the landscape without actually digging a hole. If we actually did find a group of mounds, we thought maybe these could be mounds, we would have a lot of things that are at our disposal before actually doing any kind of excavation. And if there's no reason to actually dig into that mound, we would never do it. The only time that archaeologists now in the modern era, and this is after 1970s, the only reason that we would ever dig into a Native American mound is if it was already impacted by either some kind of construction effort or something where there was an accidental discovery that had occurred and it was a salvage operation. We would never intentionally dig into mounds. We have no reason to. There's many other ways to get at knowledge without actually violating the sacredness of a burial site.
In this case, it sounds like you had already done a literature review which confirmed or at least gave enough notice that this was a naturally occurring mound that you decided to focus on the fields
surrounding them,
adjacent to the area.
Right.
Okay.
And if we had gone out into those fields and if we had found a huge amount of cultural material on the landscape, so pieces of broken pottery, pieces of projectile point tools and other things, the chipping debris, the waste materials for making stuff, fire hearths, and the landscape of village or something like that, then I'd be like, maybe these are mounds. And then somebody would have to go and do that additional ground penetrating radar work and other kinds of things just to really look into them.
So what did you find?
So what did we find? That's a great question. Well, first, I want to back up and say that all our archaeological work was done with the public whenever possible. So prior to going out and doing our archaeological work, we had a series of presentations in each of the counties where we generated interests from members of the public, and then we scheduled times, usually on weekends, to go out with them so they had the opportunity. This was all pre-COVID. This was all last fall. And we took out dozens of volunteers for each of our projects. We spread them out on the landscape. We started walking fields, as you see in some of these great pictures that are now scrolling by of us out in the field doing the work. We walked field after field surrounding these mound groups of the past. And within the bounds of the Alpha site, we didn't find any additional cultural materials for Native Americans associated with either one of those mound groups. And at the exact same time that we were doing our work, the Science Museum was finishing up its year-long study of Dakota County, and they too surveyed a portion of this mound group area, and they too did not find an archaeological site in their work. So we had two sets of information. However, we didn't just stop at the edges of the site. We had permission from landowners, and throughout this entire process for each county that we're in, every landowner that we approached and asked if, explained to them what we were doing as archaeologists, as curious, interested members of the public to find out more about the past, if we could go on their land to do this survey, every single landowner said yes. They were very excited. They showed us things that they had found previously on other places that they'd been, or they knew a lot about the historic importance of places in the past, and so they had documentation of old plat maps and old pictures of log cabins. And I did some research on Ancestry.com, and here I have all this information too. So they were really interested in the sites that we were at. Sometimes people were right out there with us. Other times they just said, go ahead and do what you want to do. Keep me in the loop. Almost all of them met us in the field whenever we were out there to at least shake our hand and say, which we can't do nowadays, and say, hey, this is a really interesting thing. I'm glad what you're doing it. So we expanded upon the landscape around these sites. And in both cases, we found one small piece of lithic chipping debris left over from somebody resharpening a tool as they're moving across the landscape sometime in the past. Might have been 13,000 years ago in the past, might have been 150 years ago in the past. But in both cases, nearby these sites, we found one piece of chipping debris.
Interesting.
One of those happened to be a piece of quartz that had been flaked off of a tool. There are different kinds of quartz. Normally, quartz is a really hard material to use because of the cleavage, the very square block cleavage pattern that quartz does. It doesn't make for very good tools. However, there's a type of quartz that comes from the Little Falls area called Winnewabic, quartz, or fat rock quartz as it's known, and it has much more of a waxy, glassy appearance, and that is much better for making tools, and we do find that on archaeological sites. So we found one piece of quartz chipping debris, and on the other one we found a piece of Swan River chert chipping debris, and Swan River chert comes from glacial cobbles that stretch throughout most of western Minnesota. So both of these pieces of chipping debris were used by peoples that either traveled through or traded with people that were coming from western or northwestern of the Twin Cities area. So we found one little piece of chipping debris, and here are some pictures of both of those amazing artifacts. Yeah, they're pretty small. And for each of those, we consider those as archaeologists, we call these isolated find spots or isolated finds. We recorded both of these with the state, and they became sites 21 DK 142 and 21 DK 143. So they were the 142nd and 143rd archaeological sites that were recorded in the Dakota County.
So these are new and
brand new sites.
They're new alpha sites now?
Nope, they're recorded sites. So alpha sites are sites where somebody has some kind of evidence in the past, whether it's from a plat book or a map or an informant saying, I think I found something. So an archaeologist has never gone out and looked at those. They're just ideas or leads, archaeological site leads. Those are alpha sites. Known sites or recorded sites are ones that are actually documented with the state. You fill out a full site form with the state archaeologist. They then decide, does this qualify to be an archaeological site? And they give it a number.
Oh, okay.
I don't get to give things numbers. I'm not that powerful. So 142 and 143. So that's the prehistoric sites. The two historic sites that we looked at, again, were the Hampton Mill and the B.H. Pettingill House. So I'll talk about each of those for just a little bit here. Well, the Hampton Mill, or 21 DKF, so the alpha sites get letters versus numbers. 21 DKF was first identified as a mill on the 1874 Andreas Atlas. We could do a whole separate talk about the Andreas Atlas. It's the first atlas that's done in the state of Minnesota that covers all of the state at one time. It's a subscription-based atlas, which means you actually paid a fee to get your copy of the atlas and to incorporate your specific information into the atlas.
Okay.
So if you wanted your house in the atlas, if you wanted a line drawing of your house, if you wanted a little bio or information about you or your business or your county in it, you paid to have it put into this atlas. So it's almost like an advertising piece for the past, but in many ways, we were still forming counties in the 1870s, splitting them up and dividing them out. You know, for example, in the 1850s, back in Ramsey County, I should have mentioned this before, but when the Gibbs family was in Ramsey County, right after 1849, right after the township, Ramsey County at that time went from where Ramsey County is today all the way up to Lake Mille Lacs.
Oh, wow.
All the way up. All of that was Ramsey County. Bam, one giant county. So we were still forming counties at this time in the 1870s and chopping them apart. So the 1874 Atlas shows us for the first time in some places, the first time it was ever on a map, what the county looked like. The first beautifully detailed set of drawings or maps for a lot of places in Minnesota. We've got some maps that, of course, begin in the 1830s, 1840s that are pretty nicely drawn maps too, usually military maps. But these Andreas Atlas are fantastic as well.
I know that the University of Minnesota has a collection of digitized maps and atlases of Minnesota and specific cities. Do you know offhand if the Andreas Atlas is one of the ones that they've made available via that digitized collection?
What you're thinking of is in the basement of the University of Minnesota library is something called the Borchert Map Library.
That's the one.
Listeners, if you've never gone down into the Borchert Map Library at the University of Minnesota, you absolutely should. Not only does it have beautiful plats from the entire history of Minnesota, but it's got the largest collection of aerial photography for the state. They've got plat books for all the different counties. They've got beautiful topographic maps for throughout all the ages for the state. And there's a group of people, a dedicated staff there who absolutely delight in the mapped past, and they are more than happy to help you take a big chunk out of each of their days to help you out with any kind of research or interests you may have. I've spent many hour in the Borchert Map Library, but nowadays almost all the things that are in that library are digitized and are available online. And they have links to topographic map systems for the entire country, aerial map data for the entire state, plat map data for the entire state. Most of it is now available online. I still like to go and look and hold in my hand the paper stuff,
right.
But I use the digital stuff too quite a bit. So anyway, the Hampton Mill, which was first documented in the Andreas Atlas of 1874, was a mill owned by Porter Martin in Hampton, Dakota County. And he and his wife and a couple other people, according to census records, are living in the county by 1865. And he builds this mill to do work there in the county. And as you know, mills can be water mills, they can be steam powered, or they can be later on gas powered and fuel powered mills. They can be doing both saw lumber mills. They can also be grain mills for making flour. So you can do lots of different things with milling. So it's first recorded in 74. We know he's living in the county at least by 65, and he owns it for several years until ultimately it's sold off when he's quite a bit older. And nearby there's also the Chicago Great Western Railroad, which gets started building in 1884 and is completed through this area in 1890. So we have a railroad line that comes through that's not on the Andreas Atlas originally. But then when we overlay images, as you'll see here in these overlays, when we overlay the locations of where the mill was at and these later shots of the railroad, we can see that the mill lays in an area nearby where this railroad line is at. And today it's in a cornfield. So this was a single-owned, individual-owned cornfield. The land is leased out by a farmer to do some farming. And we talked to them and we wanted to get access to do the work there. And we got permission from the landowner. We went out to look at the farm field. And unfortunately, the field had been planted in corn and had been harvested, and they just left the stubble and things from the corn harvest. And so we had very little visibility to actually see the ground. And since we were looking for a mill and we didn't necessarily know where it was at in the field, doing a whole bunch of shovel testing was not going to be very time effective or cost effective for the project. So we spread out and we went to go look for more things related to the later railroad line. And we found a beautiful railroad bridge that had been built that had information on it, as you see in this picture here, information from exactly when it was built, including the initials ETS 1884 for the railroad ties actually being founded in the foundry. So this is an intact 1880s rail bridge. That's a little bridge that's built in right over on the very edge of the property. We documented railroad spikes and other interesting pieces of cultural materials. We turned those things over to the Office of the State Archaeologist to consider being an archaeological site. Unfortunately, railroads are these long, linear things that move across the landscape, and they don't lend themselves well to being archaeological sites, because archaeological sites are usually discrete, short area. This one spot is where the house is at or the village is, and it's not these long linear things. So we tend not to give trails and railroads and things like that archaeological sites.
Not even a single entity like a bridge?
Nope, because it's part of this existing trail line and edge. So it ultimately was not made into an archaeological site, but the data was collected and is now with the state. So if anybody goes out to look at this in the future, if there's any kind of development, they'll probably get our information about this railroad bridge, and they'll be able to incorporate that. And they might determine to save that little portion of that bridge before it is demolished. But there's no plans at the moment. But the farmer, many farmers nowadays are becoming very environmentally conscious with their plowing and things, and definitely tilling over the soil over and over and over again and letting it be eroded is not a great way to do agriculture. It's not very sustainable. So we see a lot of minimum till and leaving materials in to sweeten the soil for years afterwards. So it's becoming more and more common that agricultural fields are left with the materials in them that keep us from doing archaeological survey. So we recommended in our report that if and when a different crop is put in or the field is cleaned in some way and we have better visibility, that someone goes back out and takes a look and see if they can find the Hampton Mill. But for now, the Hampton Mill remains a mystery.
Do you know what type of mill it was? You mentioned.
I don't. Nope. We don't know what kind of mill this mill was. We have a little bit more information, though, about the B.H. Pettingill House, which is Alpha Site 21DK-AQ. And again, this is an Alpha Site that's in a farm field that's located just south of the City of Lights as you're moving down Highway 52. What immediately strikes you, and as you look at this picture here, this aerial photography shot, is that you have a big farm field, and in the middle of it, or in the edge of it, you have this square of non-farmed land that has some trees on it, and it's a perfect square. Like,
right.
How's that happening on the landscape? That doesn't occur.
It's natural.
Right? It's natural. It just happens. No. So there's this cutout, and it's when you overlay that with a plat, you can see that there used to be a house on this property. There was an archaeologist that was doing some work for a pipeline that was going, because oddly enough, a pipeline associated with the refinery that's north of there. He did some archaeological work associated with that back in 2013, and he documented that this B.H. Pettengill property was likely what this farm material was related to. He walked in the immediately boundaried areas of that had been plowed and found late 1800s, early 1900s kinds of crockery and things like that. And he also noted a series of jumbled piles of concrete and things that potentially could have been from a structure. And that's really all he saw. He didn't put any shovels in the ground. He didn't do any additional research. So the state of Minnesota determined this to be an alpha site. So they just called it an alpha site this time. And then he recommended additional survey in the future, because his pipeline that he was actually working on was not directly where the house was at. It was nearby. So it was just a site that he was like, oh, this could be related and it's nearby, so I'm going to go check it out. So he didn't recover any of the artifacts. He just noted them in the field and went about his merry way. So we came back and we got permission from the landowner, which happens to be the oil refinery that's up there, owns a whole swath of land that's in there, and it's leased to a local farmer, and he's farming it. So we got permission from the farmer, and we got permission from the oil refinery to go out and take a look at this little piece of property. Because it's not plowed right in that area, it's all grass cover, as you can see in these photographs. We went out and shovel tested across it, and you could tell just by looking at the landscape, there was kind of a bulged over landscape. It didn't look very natural. The rest of the field is much more depressed around it, and this is kind of bulged over. So immediately I was thinking, this looks like it's been filled up with something. Someone's brought some soil in or something to cover this over. And we looked for any depressions that could have been from farmstead. We looked for these rubble piles and stuff, and we did find some rock piles. It's very common for farmers to pile up all the rocks in their fields and dump them places, so we found some of these. We found some modern materials and things on the surface, but we didn't find any clear indications of the farmstead. So then we put in a series of these shovel tests, and we documented a series of jumbled soil horizons that were indicative of dumping fill on this location. And at the very bottom of these, under a couple of feet of fill, was what looked like the original ground surface down there. So we call that a buried A horizon, or a buried surface horizon. And in that material, or down there at that original ground surface, we found a piece of amethyst glass, which is purple glass. And any archaeologist knows that we stopped the use of amethyst glass in the 1930s. Our primary place that we got the manganese to make amethyst glass was Germany. We were having a dispute with Germany in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and so we stopped the import of manganese. So it's a really good indicator. If you find amethyst glass in the landscape in an historic site, chances are it's pre-1940, so it's a really good way to think about it. And we also found other pieces of early 20th century archaeological materials in that area, so there is a buried surface out there that originally could be related to this farmstead. So we didn't find the farmstead itself. We found a buried surface that had been covered over by some other activities. So we documented that with the state. We basically added additional information to the alpha site itself, but we didn't change the status of the alpha site.
Okay.
It's still 21 DKAQ. So with all of the archaeological work that we did in Dakota County, we either found new archaeological sites immediately adjacent to alpha sites, as we did with the prehistoric sites, or we got additional information about historic properties, but we're unable to find those historic properties, which isn't surprising. Historic properties are quite ephemeral in the landscape. We tend to build in the same places or develop over the same places as people did in the past. And there's a reason that alpha sites oftentimes just stay alpha sites. They never get looked at again, but we're happy to have done that work. So because we didn't find a lot of archaeological materials associated with these 4 different site locations we went to, we reached out and talked with both Dakota County and the other counties, but specifically Dakota County. And we asked if they had other collections at the Dakota County Historical Society that we could do additional work on, collections that people had turned in the past that nothing had much been done on them yet. And it turns out that Dakota County has one of the largest archaeological collections of any county historical society in Minnesota. Tens of thousands of objects. The earliest work that was done by a gentleman by the name of Fred Lashy. He was an avid avocational archaeologist, loved to go out collecting, and he did excavation work with his son and other avocationalists on archaeological sites as far away as South Dakota. And he brought those materials back to Dakota County. And so they have a very large assemblage of both prehistoric and historic collections, including individuals have given materials from nearby farmsteads, like in Burnsville. There's the Hogan family farmstead, and there's a large midden collection that somebody brought in from there. There are other more recent archaeological materials that have been turned in by other individuals. And now Dakota County is actually a qualified repository for keeping archaeological materials. They're set up to do that work. They have to be a secure facility. They have to have a climate-controlled environment for archaeological preservation, and they have to be, committed to having space for people to do research, and they have to have a plan if things go awry and they can't be an archaeological repository anymore. They have to have a plan for where those things would ultimately go, which in most cases would be the Minnesota Historical Society itself. So we were able to collect a number of both prehistoric and historic assemblages from Dakota County and do additional analysis on those. And we talked about those reports in our previous presentation. If you get a chance, check those out.
Yes, in our overview conversation.
This work does lead, in that sort of last piece that I talked about, leads into future work that we'd hope to do in the county. One, as I said before, we got really good responses from the public, not only those interested in doing archaeology, but landowners who are more than willing to allow us to come out on their property. And the Science Museum has also done a large bit of work now in Dakota County. Lots of cultural resource management work has been done because the northern part of Dakota County is becoming more and more developed, where West St. Paul is, or South St. Paul, the airport, things like that. There was actually plans of building another airport down in Dakota County, and so there was a lot of archaeology that was done for that. There's a lot of potential for archaeological sites. The city of Hastings is a beautiful old river town that has lots of prehistoric and early historic sites in it as well. There's also fascinating little ghost towns like Nienow, an early community that got started. We could do a whole talk sometime about ghost towns, and my dissertational work was actually on early ghost towns in Minnesota. There's lots of amazing archaeological sites in Dakota County, and I hope that we continue to build on the great relationships that we established with the local landowners to continue to do a survey. But I think that the next step for the Dakota County Historical Society itself is to actually think better about and do a lot of planning around the collections that they already have. As I said, they have one of the largest, if not the largest, county historical society archaeological collection in the state, and they really need to start thinking about how to preserve, get some good counts on how many things they actually have. What's the level of documentation for those? How can they bring in the public or professionals to come in and do research around these and actually create value for these collections? I think that's their next step, and that's probably the direction they'll move in. But that's what I hope that they end up doing. I know Matt Carter very well, the executive director. He's very interested in archaeology, and I know that we'll continue to do many archaeological projects with them in the future.
Something to look forward to, for sure. Thanks again for showing us what you've done on the project and for giving us some insight into the history of, in this case, Dakota County.
My pleasure. Look forward to doing some more of these.
Yep. See you next time.
All right. Take care.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for hitting play on that and letting us view that. We did have one question, so we'll address the one question that came in. And if you have any other questions, as Jeremy said, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and get those, potentially get them answered. So the question that came in is, are you familiar with the work that was done about 50 to 80 years ago near Winnebago in Faribault County?
Yep, my answer to that is I'm not. It sounds fascinating. Very likely that work was likely done by the University of Minnesota. Early archaeological work in our state leading up to the 1960s was almost exclusively done by the Science Museum and by the University of Minnesota before we started to see a lot of other archaeological entities being formed to do work. In the 1960s, because of the National Historic Preservation Act, we started doing something called compliance archaeology or cultural resource management, and that's really the field that I am in. I love to do research and I love to get involved with small entities here and there. My work for the last 25 years, when I wasn't being a teacher full-time at various educational institutions, my work is driven by the development of work across our state. So I have unfortunately not done much work in Faribault County at all. And I wish I could tell you more about the site, but unfortunately I can't. One of the things that I did want to and feel free to type in other questions that you may have into the chat and we can take a look at them. I've got lots of extra time here. I mean, we don't need to necessarily cut off at 8 o'clock or anything like that. We can go a little bit longer past that. I just want to show a little bit in my office here and at Nienow Cultural Consultants Laboratories. We have a really large reference collection that's behind me that cites a lot of these books and things that I talked about in that volume, in that presentation, including my copy of Aborigines of Minnesota. There are not very many of these original volumes still out there. If you, as an avocational or just interested member of the public, would like to come and see any of these volumes and see them, I've got lots of white gloves and things for you to wear to paw through them, and you're more than welcome to contact me. Matt can list my email address and things like that, but you can contact me and you can come in and take a look. One of the questions I do see coming in, let's see, how accurate is the placement of houses on atlases? It's generally accurate in the sense that maps during that time would usually place the house within a certain quadrant of a quarter section. So they're usually accurate to the quarter section of land. So it's not incredibly accurate like today. That's one of the things that we as archaeologists are always challenged by. Nowadays, I can take out my handy dandy GPS unit and I can record any location to within 3 feet, right? I mean, sometimes if I get a really accurate GPS unit, I can go down to a couple of inches in terms of exactly where this thing is in the universe. But back in the Andreas Atlas, in the 1874 Andreas Atlas, locations, and usually in plat books as well, locations are usually correct within a property owner's area within a quarter section. So you have to use both an atlas and then aerial photography and maybe LiDAR and other images to sort of hone down. I know it's somewhere in this area. Those all give you little clues to it. So let's see, have any studies been done locally in Minnesota on early Euro-American pottery? Early Euro-American pottery. So this would be pottery that's coming from France, I would expect. We do have several fur trade sites that are in Minnesota. Unfortunately, just tragically, one of the most premier archaeologists for fur trade archaeology, he just died in the last couple of years. His entire collection is actually now at the St. Cloud State University. But he excavated on several fur trade sites that did have French ceramics on them. So those would be the earliest types of ceramics that we find. I personally have done fur trade work in Trempealeau in Wisconsin, and we found French ceramics there that they were trading with local Native American groups in exchange for furs. And they were also trading brass kettles and ammunition and firearms and things like that as well, seed beads and other things. If you're ever interested in finding out more about what things were being traded, there was a ship called the Belle or La Belle that went down in Louisiana just as it was coming up the Mississippi River to deliver French fur trade goods in the 1600s. It sank, and the entire vessel has been excavated, and it's basically a inventory of these are the kinds of things that we would like to trade with Native peoples. So there have been some studies on ceramics, on Euro-American ceramics or pottery for the early 1600s. They would almost exclusively be French, and usually find those when people are doing research on French fur trade sites. So that's where I would search or Google to find those. And the archaeologist who was doing most of that work, his name was Doug Burke, B-I-R-K, Doug Burke. He was one of the founders of the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, which was a large nonprofit archaeology company that got started in the 1980s and went through the early 2000s in Minnesota. And his entire reference collection and library and many of his artifacts as well are all now in St. Cloud at St. Cloud State. And you can contact Rob Mann up there you can get his information from the St. Cloud State website and just search St. Cloud State Anthropology Department and you can find out more about that. So how do we become more involved as citizen scientists? That's a great question. Jackie, I didn't plant Jackie in this at all. Jackie, thank you so much for your question. One of the best ways to get involved is to essentially talk to your local historical society and talk to the large Archaeological Avocational Society for Minnesota, which is called the Minnesota Archaeological Society, or MAS. So you can search Minnesota Archaeological Society. They've been around since the 1930s, so they're coming up on 100 years of activity, and they're an avocational-led group that routinely has information on where you can go and get in and actually do public archaeology by going out and walking with me in fields, or if you are interested in volunteering or doing lab kinds of work, many archaeology companies like my own, plus educational institutions like the University of Minnesota or the Science Museum have lots of volunteer opportunities for you to come and get involved, and we're happy to do that with you. So I would recommend you start by contacting and becoming a member of the Minnesota Archaeological Society. They actually have their annual meeting coming up on September 26th of this month. This is a big month for archaeology. It's Archaeology Month here in the state of Minnesota. So we're doing a lot of interesting things in archaeology, but the Minnesota Archaeological Society is also having its annual meeting, and it's an online meeting as well. So they're going to be presenting and talking about in a panel discussion about a recent documentary that they did called Bound by Earth. You can actually search for Bound by Earth or go to the Minnesota Archaeological Society website and watch that TPT produced documentary about archaeological work in the state of Minnesota. So that was a long answer to your question. Let's see. How do I get involved or at least find out how archaeological work? All right, I answered that question too as a twofer. I answered both of those. Matt, do you have any comments at the end of the presentation? One of the things that I recommended was potentially thinking about going after some funds to do or talk about your collections. I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about the collections that you guys have, and are those available for people to come and look at?
Yeah, so if someone is interested in seeing what we have in our collection, as Jeremy mentioned, he was involved in an earlier project that kind of did some identifying of what we do have in our actual collection in the Launching Museum, which is located in South St. Paul. If someone's interested in coming to take a look and see what we have, as Jeremy can tell you, it's not the best as far as what's identified and organized. So as Jeremy mentioned, looking for different grant opportunities, we are hoping that within the next year we can get a grant that will hire. And I apologize, one of our kids is trying to break into the room here. So we're looking into a grant where we can work with Jeremy and have him come in and basically go through our collection and give us a better understanding as to what we have. I know there's a famous picture within our organization that Jeremy's aware of a gentleman sitting, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, but there's a pile of
Chuck Diesen. That's the individual, Chuck Diesen. He's the former head of collections for the Minnesota Historical Society, longtime archaeologist, still alive in his mid 70s, worked at Fort Snelling doing archaeology for decades.
Yeah, and as he was sitting at a table in our museum, there was a pile of hundreds of projectile points in front of him. And he was just kind of staring at them, kind of in disbelief and probably amazement as, why do we have so many? So, as Jeremy said, trying to identify and get grant funds that can help us figure out for sure what we have in our collection how much of it is beneficial to us to have in our collection. As Jeremy mentioned, Fred Lashy was our organizational founder, and he went all over the region trying to track down, archaeological sites and participating in them. And for better or for worse, he brought some of that back with him. So we're trying to identify specifically, what do we have that relates directly to our collection and our county, and what could we potentially give back, and make sure it goes to a home that would be better suited for it versus what we have. And then part of that too, at the same time, is we would determine what do we need to do then to make sure everything does have the proper storage. And, we want to make sure that we're taking care of that archaeological collection that we have, mainly because it's important to have, the proper storage and everything, but also it'll ensure its safety for the future. Fred Lashy, as I mentioned, went out and spent his time and the organization trying to build that up, and we don't want to destroy it or have it go to waste. So that's one of the reasons we're hoping. And I think, Jeremy, if I remember right, that grant was due in October here. So that's a project we're hoping to get started on fairly soon.
That's great. And I will also add that every year the Minnesota Historical Society uses some of the legacy funds that are dedicated to the state by giving them to the Office of the State Archaeologist, who then produces two large grants. These are grants of like $100,000 each. And one of those always goes towards something called a statewide archaeological survey. This year's grant round, which has ended, but we're still waiting for the award to figure out who it went to, that one is for Freeborn County, so down just a little bit south of the cities, down by Owatonna in that area. So that Freeborn County survey, which should start next year, whoever gets that project, maybe I'll get it because I applied for it and I would love to do the work, but the Science Museum has gotten them in the past. Other educational institutions across the upper Midwest have gotten them as well. Whoever gets that work hopefully will be advertising with people like the Minnesota Archaeological Society, saying, hey, we're going to be down doing work in Freeborn County. If you live nearby and you would like to come and do some survey with us by walking fields and seeing what you can find, please come on and help us. So if I end up getting that Freeborn County project, I guarantee you I'll be advertising for public assistance to come help with that, to do it. So I have a question here from Kristen saying, I heard people were finding arrowheads at the Henry Sibley High School construction site. I don't know anything about that. I would recommend that if people did find some, which is pretty interesting, if people did find arrowheads at the construction site, they should call the Office of the State Archaeologist. Her name is Amanda Gronhove. Her assistant is Bruce Kunin. And you just Google Minnesota Office of the State Archaeologist. Their phone number is right there. I would call them up right away. And I would say, hey, because they're the clearinghouse for archaeological work in the state. Developers, people like myself, there's dozens of companies like my own company that are doing archaeology in Minnesota. And they basically organize it all. We have to be licensed to the state of Minnesota so anyone who's doing archaeological work anywhere, they have to know about it. So they would be the best place to go and find out, and call them and say, I heard that there are arrowheads that are being found at Henry Sibley's high school construction site. What can you tell me? Has this been looked at by an archaeologist? And if potentially they don't know about it because potentially maybe an archaeologist didn't have to go out there because it was already previously disturbed, and they're like, oh, there was a parking lot before, or oh, it's already been dug before, so we don't need to worry about it. And we just didn't know about it. It would surprise you how many archaeological sites we destroy every year in the state of Minnesota that no one ever knows anything about. There's only about 100 to 150 archaeologists operating in the entire state. Most of us, like myself, do work for various different entities and agencies and developers. We don't really have like an archaeological detective squad that's going around and trying to find and investigate all the different places where we're digging ground. So we miss a lot of stuff, and that's why we need the help of the public, so that when things like this come up, you can find out, you can inform us so that we can go. So I'd start there, and hopefully you can find some more information. So again, that clearinghouse for archaeological work in Minnesota is the Office of the State Archaeologist. That position was put in place with something called the Minnesota Field Archaeology Act. Our first state archaeologist had to be initially written into law. They had to be a professor of archaeology at the University of Minnesota. And then over the years, it became, the Office of State Archaeologist became a part of the Department of Administration. It is the smallest department within the Department of Administration in Minnesota. They have 3 people. It's a huge group, 3 people. They have a state archaeologist, an assistant state archaeologist, and then basically a keeper of the records that are there. So that's the Office of the State Archaeologist. And again, our current state archaeologist is Amanda Gronhoff. We've had, I think we've had 5 or 6 state archaeologists since the position was created. Sometimes they're there for a decade or more. Scott Amfinson was our previous state archaeologist. Before him was Mark Dudzig, and before him was Christy Kane, and it goes back from that time. So I think there were 5 or 6 state archaeologists now.
All right. Well, it looks like the questions have slowed down a bit. So with that, I'll thank Jeremy, and it's been a great opportunity to work on this project with you. And I think anyone that watched this video definitely learned a little bit about the archaeology here in Dakota County. And as Jeremy mentioned, there's 4 videos out there on that YouTube channel. I did put a link into the group chat, so if you haven't seen that, check that out. Go take a look at all those videos, and we'll be going, and here on out, if we do have any other archaeology videos that get created from this collaborative, we'll try and get them posted to that. But with that, I'll thank Jeremy one more time, and I'm sure you're all joining me with a virtual round of applause for him. If you do have any questions, feel free to send them over to me, and I'll make sure you get in contact with Jeremy. Otherwise, again, thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Good night, everybody.